Hi there, my name's Paul and I'm about to take you through the F8 revision mock exam. We're going to do this in two parts, as we do with all of our mock exam debriefs. The first thing I'm going to do is take a look at the exam paper and just take you through the questions and what they are getting at. This is the process that you need to repeat in the exam hall, typically within the first 15 minutes or so, when you've got reading time and you can't actually start writing your answers. So that's what we're going to do in this video section. And then once we've done that, it's up to you to go and have a go at the revision mock exam and see how you get on. There'll then be a follow-up video taking you through the questions in a bit more detail. But first, let's have a look at our approach. Now, of course, when it comes to approach, there are some things to think about before we even look at the exam paper. So, what have I been telling you all term? Rule 1. Explain every point you make. Generally speaking, it is usually going to be 1 mark per point that we make. So if it's a 5-mark question, we're going to aim to say 5 things. But if we can't say 5 things, don't worry too much. Your job here is not to score 100%, your job is to score more than 50%. Some questions are bound to be harder than other bits. As long as we can make at least maybe 60% of the marks on each part of each question, we're in with a pretty good chance of passing this. In general, we're going to aim for 2 to 3 lines of writing for each point we make. And one way to make sure we get 2 to 3 lines of writing is, of course, I link you back to the first point, to explain every point. So we're going to try to use the word because, or as, or in order to, and that you'll find will typically double the length of anything you were planning to write. So, a few little thoughts in advance. And the other important point to make is that as you walk into the exam hall, before you see this exam paper on exam day, you need to be thinking that you have to identify the type of question, and then you've got to think technique. Remember, around about 60–65% of the marks on F8 are not for what you know. They are for your ability to think and apply to the situation that you've got in the question. You know there are some core question types to look out for. The ethical threats, the audit risk, internal controls, substantive testing, audit reports, they all have a technique. And you've got to walk in on exam day with those techniques ready to go. Because trust me, at least 4 of those 5, and possibly all 5 of them, are going to come up. So, with all those lovely thoughts in mind, let's go take a look at the question paper and do our preparation. We're not going to read stories at this point. This is about preparing our minds so we know how to approach each question. Right, here we go then. So question number 1, ignore the story, not relevant. That will become more important later. Here we go then. So A part 1 says identify the ways in which Glencoe's inventory of components and finished excavators might be overstated. So this is a question about inventory. And the danger is overstatement, so inventory being too high. And we've got to talk about the ways in which that could happen. I notice there are 5 marks available, so I'm going to try to say 5 things. Now, of course, there might be stuff in the story, and there probably is stuff in the story that's going to help with this. But I can already think of some ways right now that inventory gets overstated, in other words, too high. Now, there's a couple of different ways you could look at this. You could say that inventory is equal to the number of units that they've got multiplied by an amount per unit. And you could then say that the amount per unit with inventory should be the lower of cost or net realizable value. Because immediately that gives us three different things to aim at. Ask, why might the number of units be too high? Why might the cost be too high? Why might the net realizable value be too high? We've then got another useful way of breaking this down, because in the question it says components, well that's raw materials, and finished goods. So maybe it will be helpful after we've had a first think about this to maybe break it down between raw materials and finished goods. So let's have a think. Why might the number of units be too high in the inventory list? Well, one reason could be problems at the stock count. Because if they've counted, for example, the same area twice, that could do it. I'm also assuming that excavators are those big things which so frequently seem to be coloured yellow that sit on building sites and have a big digger on the front. And I'm thinking that as well as a big digger on the front, an excavator has got some very annoying things on the bottom which are round and covered with rubber, and they're called wheels. And the reason I don't like wheels is things with wheels have this annoying habit of moving, which of course would increase the chance of you counting it twice. So even before I read the story, I can see a potential problem that they might count things twice if they're moving around. I'm also thinking that another typical reason that companies overstate the quantity of inventory they've got is they count items that don't belong to them. So if there's any evidence in the story that there could be items that look like their inventory, so raw materials, components and finished excavators on site that don't belong to the company, then that would lead to a risk of overstatement as well. Of course, those are not the only reasons that the quantity could be too high. It might not be counting, it might be a problem with the records. So I'm also thinking that quantities would be too high if they have double counted purchases, or they've missed off sales. And both of those would lead to quantities being too high. And I'm liking the look of this question because it's worth 5 marks, and I already seem to have got 4 separate reasons why just the quantity could be too high. Let's move on to cost. Why might the cost be too high? Well, if they are using standard costs and they've not been updated recently, well, costs tend to go up over time. So if they're using out-of-date standard costs, that would do it. Now that, I'm thinking more about raw materials. Also thinking about finished goods. Well, finished goods with a manufacturer are going to involve raw materials, labour and overheads. So if they are over-absorbing overheads, for example, if they've got some non-production overheads being built into the value of their inventory, that would do it too.